Good morning, everyone. We are the Group 5 and we are here to present our process observation analysis entitled Proceedings of the Gender and Development webinar of Attorney Leandro Opetina in collaboration with Ininiera of TIP Quezon City, dated Thursday, the 28th of October 2021 via Zoom meeting. But before that, I would like to present to you my teammates. Our leader, Mr. Adrian Umali and Miss Charmaine Rose Montesilio, and Mr. Irvin Joshua Reyes, and me, Flores C. and John B. The next slide. On the next slide, showing the key person participants on the webinar with 794 students who joined from both TIP campuses. This table compose the TIP officials, the Ingenieura organizations who spoke the most during the meeting. On to the next slides, please. This shows the objective for organizing the webinar, which shows the main three focus discussions stated on the slide, which has the most recorded time in the Zoom meeting. And from here, the researchers was able to come up with the process element table showing up on screen, which includes the two main elements during the webinar, which are being a participator and the task behavior. These are the two main major elements during the webinar. The researchers omitted the element of a group atmosphere since it was not really a two-way form of discussion. The elements, the participations, refers to the verbal interaction addressing the following three questions stated on the first column, and the second column focus on the task behavior addressing addressing who had the most interactions in the webinar. That leads to the three stated achieved goals listed on the second column. Okay, for the time frame, um, illustrating a pie chart with corresponding number of percentage allocation time spent for the gender and development. Webinar started at exactly 9:30 in the morning and lasted for about 2 hours and 3 minutes. The webinar was a 2-day event, and the observers attended the second day of the webinar dated on the 28th of October 2021. These process observation analyses focus on the total productive time of the webinar. The productive time is determined by the criteria of where the brief topics are being discussed, and the total productive time is computed to be 72.5% as what shows on the pie chart, which is equivalent to 89.6 in minutes of the whole recording. The other ones are setup time, which has 3.6% equal to 4.5 in minutes. The opening program, which is 13.6% equivalent to 16.8 in minutes, and closing programs, which is 10.3% equivalent to 12.77 minutes, which is in total of 123.67 in minutes. And yep, the next slides just only shows that the researchers only used 5 instruments to this study. The next slide is the process observation table. In this part describes the number of statements of each group members conveyed during the discussion. In this matrix, limits on the verbal interaction only. As what we can see, Attorney Leandro Apetina got the most number of percentage in the total recorded time, which is 83.7 minutes. The another process observation table showing the time spent of the speakers who are actively participating in the topic, which corresponds to the time spent by the key figures relating to the task behaviors only. Then the communication and interacting matrix to help the webinar involving the audience participation, as these matrix not restrict the verbal communication only but also considering the incoming chat responses of the student audience that were mentioned by the host. The student advice from the student audience that were mentioned by the host. Next slide, please. In these analysis tables, it only tells us the participation matrix of the frequency of statement conveyed during the discussion, and Tony Leandro Petina and Mariel Abaca were the highest participants, and shows also that in terms of frequency of statements carried out, Dr. Jesusa Padilla and Ma'am Mildred Morales and Engineer Marian Yumol were the lowest participants among the key figures in the webinar. And then on the analysis of the graphical representation of participation between the host and the guest speaker, it's only tell us that Mr. Leandro Opitina, being as the guest speaker of the webinar, had the more opportunity to give statements compared to the rest of the key figures. And Mariela Baca, having been one of the hosts of the webinar, is one of the reasons that made him speak more. And on these analyses of graphical representation of time spent by each key figure during the webinar, which is illustrated in a pie chart, it only tells us the low participation of Dr. Padilla, Dr. Morales, and Engineer Yumal, which can be justified by their positions as keynote speakers. It has been observed that the keynote speakers only have very few lines, as they only need to brief the audience of information surrounding the topic of the webinar. And in terms of time spent by the key figures in speaking during the webinar, this one shows that Attorney Leandro Petina and Mariela Baca were the highest participants during the discussion, while Engineer Yumul received the least amount of statement due to only being introduced when the webinar was about to end. And then also in these analyses, figure 4 graphical representation of communication and interaction matrix with hosts, the keynote speakers, and the audience. It only tells us who was addressed and spoke the most. On this frequency distribution table of the group task behaviors in the group discussion in the webinar, as you can see, giving information has the highest count, which is 54.9%, while the statements pertaining to summarizing were at least observed at 2%. Additionally, 404 statements conveyed during the meeting, but only 244 statements were related to task behaviors only. On the other hand, the frequency distribution of individual task behavior observed, and it has been observed that the highest frequency count is in giving information and opinion. Attorney Leandro Petina having the highest participation, conveyed at 81.34% of the statements in giving information and opinion. Hello. In the frequency distribution of task behavior illustrated in a pie chart, first is seeking information, which is 7.8%. Then second, giving information, which is 54.9%. Third is clarifying, which is 35.2%. present. Then last one is summarizing statement, which is 2.0%. And on these two analyses of the frequency distribution of task behavior between the host and the keynote speaker, and between the host and the guest speakers, only tells us the distribution of the individual task behavior observed in the discussion in the webinar. And for the researchers' conclusion in the webinar, that at the end they were able to achieve the planned goals of discussing the Magna Carta of women, discussing acts that are considered as violence towards women and children, and raising awareness that the state can ensure the safety of women and children. As the meetings the observers attended in a webinar, Attorney Leandro Petina had the most statement made and had most of the webinar's time spent on him for 83.7 minutes. Keynote speakers Dr. Jesus Padilla, Dr. Mildred Morales, and Engineer Marian Yumol only had one statement each for themselves. Host Mariel and host Frances Soto drove the webinar quite well, with only very minimal dead ears and almost instant responses to each other. And a planned intervention or recommendation from the researchers. The webinar does not seem to be in need of any intervention. The webinar's topic discussion is not too long to be advised to just be a recorded session, nor it is too short to be brief in an email, given that the topic of the webinar is interesting enough as it is very relevant. Maybe the facilitators can extend for another 30 minutes for a longer open forum and have more questions answered. Alternatively, the observers also advise the use of a video recording for the guest speaker. The observers think that with the use of a recorded discussion, the facilitators can minimize the time consumed by the discussion, as the guest speaker is given time to have a structured script to read and adjust. Through this, the facilitators can prolong the time to be spent on the open forum. Therefore, more questions can be answered by the guest speaker. With that in mind, the facilitator should then give the link to the open forum earlier in the meeting so that there would be less dead air or waiting time for questions to pop up. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.